So thank you so much, Jared. Please, for people who don't know who you are, for the one person in the world who doesn't know who you are, Dr. Jared Cooney-Horvath, who are you and what are you doing here?
Nice to meet you all. I'm Jared. I'm a teacher turned neuroscientist who focuses on the science of learning. And Dr. Bott, who are you?
Well, it's a good question. Firstly, I'm not a doctor, but I do have a very passionate background in education. I was a teacher for 15 years, also have a training in psychology. And for the last 10 years, really, I've worked in this field of positive education, which is really trying to bring well-being science into the heart of education around the world. And I work with schools and educators, governments around the world to really try and emphasize the importance of well-being in schools. And we met a couple of years ago, Jared, and have enjoyed debating, discussing, thinking about the future of education. And that's why we wrote the book. And that's why we're here today. So why don't you kick us off?
So tonight we're going to look at, last time we looked at computers and ed, tonight we're going to look at this issue of 21st century skills. These competencies, right? We got critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity. Woohoo! We all want them. We all love them. The problem is here. So right now, if you graduate from University of Melbourne, you need to prove you have these graduate attributes, these 21st century skills. You cannot get a degree unless we check a box and say, yes, this kid demonstrates creativity. They demonstrate critical thinking. So everyone who graduates has these skills. Congratulations. Problem, of all those kids who move from university into work, 48% of them get fired within the first 16 months. And the remainder take anywhere between 18 and 24 months before they begin demonstrating those 21st century skills. So we got a problem. Here they're showing them just fine at university, change context into the workplace, and they all disappear. What the heck just happened? Now, believe it or not, this isn't just new employees. Same thing happens across the board. Ron Johnson, creative genius. Those are his words, not mine. He was a dude who invented the Apple iStore. So he demonstrated creativity on the largest of scales. What happens? He gets poached by struggling retailer JCPenney. They say, come over, be our CEO, save us, bring your creativity, make it work. And 17 months and $6 billion in losses later, they fire Ron Johnson's bum, not an ounce of creativity to be found. So here we've got a guy who showed a skill on the largest stage, changes context, and the whole thing disappears. Carly Fiorina, she was a woman who brought Lucent Technologies out of the doldrums through her collaboration prowess. She could build teams, get people to work together. What happened? She gets poached by HP. They say, come save our company. And a divided board and 30,000 layoffs later, they fire her, not an ounce of collaboration to be found. She couldn't even get 12 people around a table to work together. Biggest stage, disappears. What is going on with these 21st century skills? What we're witnessing is called the transfer dilemma. Now, transfer, as you all know, is how do we take knowledge skills from one context and apply them meaningfully somewhere else? And ideally, at the end of the day, transfer is one of the primary goals of education. Big secret of transfer is this. Transfer never happens automatically. And I mean never. Transfer is a conscious process that we all must go through. And in order to successfully transfer, there are 3 hurdles we all have to overcome. And I'm going to walk through those hurdles now. The first hurdle is this, knowledge. This is the first bump to successful transfer. Now, what do I mean by knowledge? To understand, I'm going to go to a metaphor Dan Willingham used a while back. He said, for the longest time, we used to think that human beings thought like a calculator. Now, the way a calculator works is simple. You've got knowledge, skills, abilities over on this side. You've got facts, data, information over here. So long as you have a skill locked down on a calculator, then it doesn't matter what facts you put in. You can use your skill. So here I've got addition assigned to a button. Now I can put in anything I want. 321 plus 785 plus 496. Doesn't matter what I put in. So long as I have a skill, I can use that skill. Problem, human beings do not think like calculators. In human beings, every skill we have is intimately dependent upon the skills we have to use it with. If we do not understand, the facts, if we do not understand the facts, the knowledge we have to apply our skill to, then there is no skill for us to use. This is why the first hurdle of transfer is this. Facts always precede skills. I don't care how deep your skill is. If you don't understand the facts, there is no skill there for you to use. Just as a simple demonstration, let's take the skill of critical thinking. Now, I guarantee you, you all have this skill. You wouldn't get to where you're at in your careers if you didn't. You've been using it for the last 10 minutes with us. You got this skill, congratulations. All I'm going to do is tell you a story, and I want you to use your critical thinking skills here. So a couple years ago in the Journal of Behavioral Brain and Medicine, an article was published that demonstrated that when neutrinos in the left medial temporal lobe started to spin in a clockwise fashion, this generated a radio signal detectable by bold MRI recording. So I want you to go ahead and use your critical thinking skills and tell me what methodologically went wrong with that research, or if it's accurate, what does that suggest about how we've been analyzing bold MRI data for the last 30 years? So go ahead, use your critical thinking skills, tell me what's what.
Do you want me to answer?
If you can. Heck, do you have any idea?
I have no idea.
Of course not. No one does. Why? Because you don't have the skill? No, because you don't have the knowledge. Doesn't matter how deep your skill is. If I bring in facts you don't get, there is no skill there for you to use. So that's our first hurdle of knowledge. Of transfer. Once we get over that first hurdle, our next hurdle then is contextualization. Here is when we see that skills are not consistent across different contexts. So let's just take the skill of collaboration. When I'm working over at St. Vincent's and we're doing brain surgery, collaboration in the operating room is very specific. You do your job, I do my job. There is very little discussion. There is almost no debate. We trust each other completely to do their expertise. But at any time, anyone in the room can say, stop, highest to the lowest, we'll look at that person, they can voice an opinion. That is collaboration in the operating room. When I'm working in the lab, collaboration is totally different. Here, I'm going to pit my expertise against yours. I'm going to battle you. We're going to fight our ideas to see whose comes out on top, who can better understand or make sense of the knowledge. That's still collaboration, totally different set of sub-skills. When you're inventing something, I've never done this, but I imagine in these invention labs like at Google and Apple, there is no expertise. So here we're throwing as many ideas as we can together to try and develop a collaborative, a unified group expertise. In all of these scenarios, you are collaborating, but you're doing very different sub-skills. So once you have the knowledge of whatever field you want to move your skills into, that next hurdle is contextualization. You have to use that knowledge to redefine the skills and say, with this knowledge, what does creativity mean? What does critical thinking look at? And once you've got your new definition or your new context, now you've got hurdle number 3, adaptation. Now you actually have to tweak your skill to match this new context, this new definition. And this is probably the hardest hurdle you're going to have to overcome. And to understand this hurdle, and this is where we're going to tie it down here, I just want to briefly walk you through the basic learning process. So at a biological level, learning requires only one essential ingredient, and it's this: repetition, 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 repetition. Now, don't misunderstand when I say repetition, some people assume I just mean rote memorization. No, any repetition. Go for a walk, read a book, play a game, any form of repetition of an idea or a skill, that's how the brain, the body starts to lock that skill down. Now, as you repeat, your brain, your body kind of goes through 4 stages. So let's say I take up golf. I've never golfed a day in my life. I'm just flailing my arms around. My brain begins in what we call top-down processing mode. This is when it is furiously trying to make sense of, what am I doing? What are these arm movements? What's happening? Now I keep practicing. I keep repeating. I keep repeating. What happens is my brain starts to adapt. It starts to change. We get plasticity and the brain says, well, sweet, he seems to be doing this motion a lot. Let's just make it easier, a little bit more efficient. Now I keep practicing. I keep practicing. I keep practicing. Eventually my brain says, sweet, I'm just going to build you a module or a network. You seem to do this so much. Let's just devote an entire network to nothing but this one skill. Now I keep practicing. I keep practicing. I keep practicing. And I end at what we call bottom-up processing. Now the brain can run that skill on autopilot. It doesn't even need me. It gets input. It automatically sends out the output. So through repetition, our basic biological learning process is this: top-down, plasticity, build a module, bottom-up. Top-down, plasticity, build a module, bottom-up. Problem: as you go through that process, what do you think happens to your ability to adapt that skill? So as I take a skill from top-down, plasticity, build a module, bottom-up, what happens to my ability to adapt, change that skill? You probably got it. It narrows. Adaptability narrows with automaticity. Now, why? You probably figured it out. Once the brain makes something automatic, in order for me to change it, I have to consciously bring that up into conscious awareness in order to change it. And anytime I stop thinking about it, it just goes back to autopilot mode. One of the adaptability, it becomes harder and harder to change skills as you automate them. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible. We do it all the time. It just means it requires conscious effort. It's not an easy process. Just keep an eye on the time. Yeah, I got my 2 minutes. So let's go back to our golf example. Tiger Woods practices this all day, every day. Why? Because he wants golf to be automatic. One of the best athletes in the world, when you put a golf clubs in his hand, replace that with a baseball, and all of a sudden Tiger Woods can't even throw. This dude can't move his athletic skills from one sport to another. Why? Because he's locked down the skills so hard in this sport that there's no automatic transfer over here. Now he needs to consciously work. Now, if he does work at baseball, he can get good at it. It's just not automatic. An easy example of this. Back in the late 70s, a group of researchers brought in a group of kids, and for 1 hour a day, they did nothing but memorize numbers, random strings of digits to see how many numbers in a row can you memorize. And they wanted to show that with practice, you can get savant-like memory skills, right? So what happens? They practice. Every student started at around 7 to 10 digits is what they can memorize on the first day. Over the course of 2 years of practice, watch how many digits these kids could memorize. After a couple years, this dude in blue can memorize 80 numbers with ease. He could take a minute and a half to hear them, memorize them, a minute and a half to spit it back. He could do it perfectly. But it turns out these researchers, they were kind of interested in this, but they were also really interested in transfer. And at the end of these studies, whenever these kids said, you know what, I'm done, I'm going to quit, I'm sick of doing numbers an hour a day for 2 years, I'm out. The researcher said, yep, cool. Before you leave, though, I want to do one more experiment. So before you leave, I want to play the same game with you. We're going to memorize a string of information, but instead of numbers, I'm going to use letters. Once they made the switch from numbers to letters, what do you think happened to their memory? Right back to normal. Why? Because adaptation of a skill, they automated a skill so well in one area that it doesn't automatically transfer. Now, again, adaptation isn't impossible. Let's say these kids started working with just letters. It might only take them 2 months to get up to 80 letters, whereas it took them 2 years to get there with numbers. We think adaptation moves faster than original learning, but it is never automatic. So here's our transfer dilemma with 21st century skills. You want to start moving your skills? First, you got knowledge hurdle, then context, then adaptability. What are the facts? How does that redefine my skill? Now, how do I move my skill? And if those 3 steps sound familiar, it's because they have a much more familiar name. It's this. It's learning. The steps of knowledge, context, adaptation, of transfer is the same thing that's the same exact process we call learning. So this means earlier I lied to you. When I said human beings do not have any standalone skills that can be applied wherever, whenever, I lied. Turns out we think we have one. Can you guess what it is? Learning. Learning is the only freely transferable skill we think we have. Why? Because that process is the skill that allows us to step into these different contexts. Whether you're going into law, medicine, dentistry, plumbing, it doesn't matter. You're going to go through this same learning process. Know the process. That's where you're going to get your transfer. And that's the key skill that people need to move. Doesn't matter what the world's going to do. 150,000 years, we've used the same learning process. It ain't changing anytime soon. That is your C21st century skill there. Now, I'm going to hand it over to David now, so you can have a little go, David. But before you kick off, anything that jumped out that you want to throw out?
No, I loved it. Some great comments coming. Thanks, Jared. Paul recommended David Epstein's book, Range, which is a really cool book. And I love James' comment, said best possible haircut for Jared, Bruce Willis in 12 Monkeys. So a little recommendation. I like that we're just kind of critiquing your music style, haircut.
That's all right. Hey, I'm having one of those days. I was debating wearing a hat tonight, but I'm okay. I'm just gonna go with this. My coif.
I wanted to start here. Actually, this is the quote that's at the very front of the chapter, and I love this quote. I think it really summarizes everything you've said, Jared, and everything we've written in the chapter. And it's this: that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I love this. And I love where you left it, Jared, that learning is maybe the only genuinely transferable, innately programmed skill that we can apply across all different contexts. And I think never before has it been so important that we can do that. Obviously, as the workforce particularly, but even the environment, the society that we're moving into, as it starts to change more and more rapidly, the capacity to learn, unlearn, relearn is so crucial. And I'll show you some statistics later in the next 5 or 10 minutes from particularly from the World Economic Forum that just highlights this exact point. And this is why learning, in our opinion, and certainly in my opinion, learning is the most important skill that schools should be teaching right now. Let's keep that quote in mind as we start to explore these 21st century skills that we're so familiar with. So I thought I might just share with you some of the skills that schools around the world are valuing right now. You know, these are kind of modern day skills: creativity, integrity, health, tolerance, critical thinking, morality, kindness, resilience, collaboration, trustworthiness, compassion, hope, communication, loyalty, perseverance, mindfulness. There's many, many others, but there's not a person on this call who looks at one of those and says, look, David, that's junk. That's not an important skill for students to learn. That's irrelevant for Australians. And in fact, in Saudi Arabia, perseverance is junk. No one's saying that, right? All of these are crucial. There's many other skills that we need to be teaching our students. Now, at a really famous meeting back in 2002 in Dallas, these 16, 20, 30 skills were placed on a table. And it was a conference, actually a breakfast conference sponsored by the National Education Association in the US. And there were 6 kind of large organizations that were part of it, including Apple, Cisco, AOL, Time Warner, Microsoft, and a couple of others. Large American organizations, businesses that sat around a table at this breakfast meeting in Dallas in 2002 and looked at these kind of skills, and they wanted to design kind of a focus. They're really trying to consider, what are the 21st century skills? What are the skills that we really want as major American employers? What do we want schools to focus on? They looked at all of these, and they said, actually, we want them all. They're all important. Because I don't want someone at working at Microsoft who's not kind. I don't want someone working at Microsoft who's not compassionate or trustworthy or loyal or tolerant or creative or with great integrity. So actually they decided all of them are important, but that's too hard for schools to focus on all these. Let's kind of just get out a red pen. We'll just scribble out those ones. Let's just go with the 4 C's. Like, they're pretty good. Like, they're 4 C's, nice, has a nice ring about them: creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, communication. Let's go with those. And in fact, they're probably 4 of the most important for our bottom line economics. You know, this is, if we can get these 4 core skills in young employees that are coming into our company, maybe we make more money than even loyalty or compassion. So let's kind of call these the 21st century skills. That story is the history of how 21st century skills came about. They were created in a breakfast meeting in 2002 in Texas. The American Education Department signed off on them. And these are the 21st century skills that you and I all know. Now, we are not saying that any of those are bad. We love all of those. There is no problem with creativity. It's a great skill. Collaboration, amazing. But there's no way that collaboration, in my mind, is more important than morality or loyalty or perseverance or trust or health or integrity for the betterment of the world. And clearly schools are, surely schools are here to create students that can go on to contribute meaningfully to creating a better, safer, kinder planet, right? All of those skills are important, including those top 4. But for some reason, we've zoomed in on these. And the reason is because it benefits those large American, international, maybe organizations. This is a Latin phrase that is in our book. It actually appears in a different chapter, which we'll talk about later. But this Latin phrase is a really cool phrase that we came across in writing the book, cui bono. It translates roughly to whom is it a benefit, or really, who wins? It's a Latin phrase, a kind of a legal phrase meaning who wins, right? And this is such a crucial question for educators that we want people to be asking all the time in your practice, in your school, in your leadership. Who am I serving? Like, in this process, in this practice, in this policy, who wins here? Who am I serving? And when we ask this question, cui bono, to those 4 21st century skills, who wins if we emphasize those skills above others? The answer is, really, the only reasonable answer we can come to is Microsoft, Apple, Dell, Google. Maybe they win, maybe, because they can create better, faster, cheaper products. Maybe they can get students, 20, 30, 25-year-old students coming out of school who are able to more rapidly develop the next version of Facebook. Maybe they win. Does society win? Do we have a more peaceful planet? Do we protect Mother Nature? Do we have better communities with those four things above others? No. But maybe the workforce, whoever this kind of vague, maybe they win, right? If that's true, right? If that's true and these other ones are less important, what we should be seeing is that in the last 20 years, with this exaggerated emphasis on those 21st century skills, surely we should be seeing a workforce that's better, more well-adapted, more well-refined, more productive. But what we see actually is not that. What we see is not that. And there are many ways to measure this. My favorite, and it's one Jared and I are looking at the moment, is really sophisticated, interesting. It's not perfect, but a really interesting measure of the success of these skill sets is the Human Capital Index that comes from the World Bank. Now, the World Bank just last year produced its first 10-year scan of the world, 174 countries, looking at the human capital development from 2010 to 2020. Human capital is this. Human capital are the knowledge, skills, and health that people accumulate throughout their lives to enable them to realize their potential as productive members of society. Right? These are the life skills of contribution to the world. And what we see in this graph, which looks a little kind of complex, but let me explain it to you. What this graph is showing is the 174 countries, and it's comparing 2010 to 2020. Any country that's above that line has seen an increase in its human capital index over the last decade. Any country that's below that line has seen a decrease in its human capital index. This is readiness for life of school students. Right? This is measuring readiness for life, the skills, knowledge, health that we need to successfully navigate life. And what you see is many countries have increased their human capital index. In fact, the overall increase is 2.6% over the last 10 years. So that's a good thing, right? But actually, this big clump that you see there, that's where almost all of the first world industrialized countries sit. That's Australia, that's the US, it's Canada, it's Sweden, it's Denmark, it's New Zealand. In fact, New Zealand's below the line. What we see in these countries really that have most fully embraced 21st century skills is that their readiness for the world, the real world, the workforce hasn't really changed much at all. In fact, in the case of New Zealand, some other countries, it's gone down. So really, are these 21st century skills really serving the workforce? It's an interesting question. We need to keep asking it because the answer isn't clear. What is clear is this, right? And this comes from the World Economic Forum. Again, some new data. It's just come out in the last couple of months. What we do know is that the workforce is more fluid, more dynamic, more changeable than it's ever been by a long way, by a huge margin, right? And so this is a statistic showing that by 2025, the next 5 years, 50% of all employees will need reskilling by 2025. Here's another stat. 40% of current workers' core skills are expected to change in the next 5 years. So if you're trying to tell me that you think you know what skills students need in the workforce, and somehow we're reverse engineering our grade 3, 8th grade, year 11, 12 curriculums to try and create students that are ready for some vague workforce that's changing this seems like such a crazy concept that somehow we've chosen collaboration, creativity, communication, and critical thinking as the 4 skills that we can somehow program into students at school, and then they'll just go into the workforce and those things will be fine.
Now, I'm going to jump in here because what were you going to say? You were going to say something.
No, please, Joe, go.
There's some good questions, but there's something that I want to bring out that I think a lot of people are thinking. All of this discussion becomes absolutely moot if you don't assume that the purpose of school is to get kids ready for jobs. Once you eliminate the idea that a K through 12 generalized education is meant for employment, which I don't know where the hell that idea came. In fact, I do, but we'll talk about that another time. Then all of these arguments become nonsense. Who cares whether or not a kid can get a job? In fact, there's a lot of evidence that shows if you really want a job, a 2-year apprenticeship is going to do a lot more for that job than a K through 12, 12-year generalized education. So once we start to step away from that notion of jobs, you start to say, okay, interesting. What are the skills that we might generally care about, want to cultivate? And very few of them will have to do with job readiness. The trick is, though, is to recognize, and what I love is, sorry, I got to throw this in, because most progressive educators point to this 21st century skills as a revolt against schooling that was based on the industrial model, where this is just a conveyor belt and we're just pumping kids through and they sit there and they memorize things. And they said school isn't about making workers, employees, it's about building human beings. That's why we focus on 21st century skills. And these people fail to realize that no, 21st century skills you're proclaiming are important were hand selected by businesses as those skills needed by their employees. This isn't a progressivist argument. When you focus on C21 skills, that doesn't change the game. That's still just discussing how do we pump out employees. So just interesting aside. Now, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that I really wanted to hit, David. So give me one second on this, and then we're going to get to our last question here. The first one is from Craig. He says that learning process. So we've got knowledge, context, adaptation. In the learning sciences, we tend to call that surface learning, deep learning, and transfer learning. I know transfer is weird because it appears twice, but that is the learning process. So Craig then asks, is this the same process for procedural, so motor skills, and declarative knowledge skills? Absolutely. The facts, it's easier to understand knowledge in the declarative realm, but the facts relevant to a motor skill are the sub skills that are a part of that. To write it, to hold a pen, what do I need? I need a pen, I need fingers, I need to know how to move all these things. So that same process is for both motor skills and declarative, what we'll call cognitive skills. Doesn't change across that board. Victoria then asked, there's a good question. Recently there was, and I saw this on Twitter, I didn't read the things, but these parents who are at home in the UK teaching their kids because of COVID, and they have PhDs in their field of math, and they're saying, oh, why is it hard to teach? There's a big point on this. Teaching is itself a skill. It is a developed practice that has its own definitions, its own understanding, its own tools, its own structure. So the people who say knowledge is all important for teaching, no. Teaching is important for teaching. So we're not going to talk too deeply about this here, but if you read the first 2 chapters of the book, it makes this argument that expertise in a field, teaching is a field, which means you can develop expertise in the craft of teaching. Just because I know math doesn't mean I know how to teach math. And just because I know how to teach math doesn't necessarily mean I have deep, abiding knowledge of math. The fields of expertise are very different. And here's where we start to recognize that teaching itself is a craft, which means the only experts in teaching are teachers. I can't tell you how many times I work at university with some of the smartest people in the world when it comes to fields like learning, neuroscience, worst teachers you will ever see, because they've never taken a moment to see, what is teaching like? What is the knowledge relevant to teaching? What are the skills? How do I contextualize that knowledge to develop skills? And then how do I adapt my knowledge over here to meet those skills? So yes, there is a very hard line between teaching and knowledge. And just because you have a PhD in math, not going to make you a great teacher. It doesn't mean you're going to be a horrible teacher, but the two are dissociable.
Jared, I want to, was one question with Michelle that we're not going to get a chance to get to all the questions. We've got to most of them. The really interesting question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, and maybe I'll chip in 1 or 2 thoughts, but Michelle has had a couple of comments and a question about our book is called 10 Things Schools Get Wrong. But then Jared and David have been banging on about systemic stuff and ATAR and exams and the system. Surely there's nothing a grade 3 elementary primary school teacher can do about all this stuff. It's ATAR scores, entrance scores, examination stuff. What's your take on that angle? How much power does the individual teacher have or school have to shift?
That is what the through line of the book becomes, is there's a lot of these issues with school are systemic. But what happens is us as teachers, as individuals within the system, we adhere to that systemic change. So we keep waiting for a top-down savior, for somehow, why won't the government change their mind? They won't. They have no reason to, because there's zero pressure on them to do so. So what we start to see is, and what we talk about in the book, is this concept of translation and what we call skunk works, is how do we as individual teachers in our context, in our classroom with our students, because nobody else understands that milieu other than you, how do we start to play? and then use that play to start to gather evidence. So we start to grassroots this stuff. Once we as teachers begin to address these problems in our own classroom, the ATAR one is a big one. There's a school I work at down south where half the teachers just said, I stopped caring about marks. I stopped caring about grades. I stopped caring. The rest of the school still does it. These ones just stopped. And in their classroom, they stopped. And that started to spread till now it's about half the school. All the teachers, well, half the teachers are now saying, no, we don't want to do this. Why? Because we're still getting great evidence from these teachers of efficacy, of success. The kids are happy, they're learning. Nothing is really breaking by changing our flow. But again, that came from a grassroots level. So at the end of the day, all of these things might be systemic issues, but they boiled back down to us to say, okay, us as teachers, what can I do tomorrow to play with this, gather my evidence, and start pushing back upwards from the ground up?
That's been heaps of fun. Jared, thank you so much. It's been really, really fun discussing that stuff with you. Thank you to everyone again who turned up today and engaged in the discussion. Loving your support, loving your comments. Really, really fun to explore this stuff with you. And hopefully we'll see you next time for the final seminar or final workshop next week on mindset. And the mindset chapter is mind-blowing. We're going to throw a few bombs and explore this at a really deep, challenging level. Thanks, guys. Stay well, stay safe. See you.
Thank you all. I'll see you guys all later.
Bye.